Today, we are honored to welcome independent journalist Eleanor Goldfield to our independent media class, brought to you by the Park Center for Independent Media. So Eleanor, how about you just jump right in and, I don't know, tell people who you are, what you do, and how did this happen?
How did this happen? Who are we really? Um, well, so I'm an independent journalist, a filmmaker, what I call a creative radical, which is really just me being a word nerd, and radical is the root of that word is in fact root. So there's my word nerdery for the day. And I kind of fell backwards into independent journalism. I was initially writing for recording magazines and audio tech magazines because I worked as an audio tech in Los Angeles for several years, teaching people how to fix their own amps and stuff like that, how to fix your guitar cable, that kind of, it's very, very, very riveting thing, journalism. And then when Occupy started, I went down there because it was right down the street from where I lived at the time in downtown LA, and they needed some media folks, and I was like, well, I kind of am. And so I started doing media work for them, and then that kind of snowballed. I had a TV show with Free Speech TV for 5 years, and started doing a lot more frontline journalism and independent journalism, which I'll talk a little bit about right now, if you just want me to keep rolling, Mickey.
Yeah, keep rolling. You can just go ahead and just keep talking. I don't need to interject.
Okay. But feel free to.
Surprise. Yeah, surprise.
And y'all are welcome to interject too. Nothing is, this isn't the UN, although the UN is much of a joke these days anyway. But I'll start off by saying that there's no such thing as objective journalism because there's no such thing as an objective life, right? We're all shaped by our life experiences. We have subjective ways of looking at everything, from something as simple as a chair to something as complex as domestic and certainly global news. So the example that I like to use often is, let's say that it's raining. Well, it's not your job as a journalist to say that it's raining. That's a weather report. Your job is to talk about the context of that rain. So what do you choose to talk about? Who do you choose to interview? Do you choose to interview the banker who can't have his party on his yacht because it's raining? Do you choose to talk to the unhoused people? Who do you already have connections with? That says a lot about your subjectivity. Do you talk about the fact that this is torrential rain that shouldn't be happening unless there was climate chaos, or do you completely ignore that? So all of these angles that you choose or do not choose speak to your life experiences and your subjectivity. So there's no such thing as an objective perspective, right? And I think the important thing is to be open and honest about that, right? Don't claim objectivity. That will ultimately be the first of many lies that you peddle to your audience, and something that corporate media does all the time, right? Oh, we're objective, we're not taking sides, but obviously they are. They are more often than not taking the sides of the people who pay for their salaries and the status quo of the establishment. So when I go into a space, I don't pretend to be objective. I am honest with people. And that doesn't mean that I go in and I just, walk in with my guillotine shirt and start saying, burn the system down. I walk into a space and do what journalists do, which is listen. But if somebody asks me, and if they're asking me about the outlet and things like that, and about my journalism, I'm very honest with them about that. And I tailor that depending on who I'm speaking to. For instance, if I walk into a pipeline blockade camp where I'm not only doing journalism, but I'm also helping with things like ground support or things like that, then I'm going to talk about it in a different way than I do if I'm walking into, for instance, a UMWA meeting, which is the United Mine Workers of America, which I went to several of their meetings when I was in West Virginia. I'm going to talk about it differently. And this is not because I'm trying to hide anything. It's just because different people have different ways of talking about political perspectives or the political spectrum. So, for instance, kind of a funny story, when I went down to West Virginia and spoke with Terry Steele, who's a former mine worker there, he asked me, he's like, so what are you? And he was like, so are you liberal? And I was like, I really don't like that word. And he said, so what? And I was like, well, I'm left of liberal. And he's like, "Oh, I'm not really familiar with that." And I was like, "Well, let me ask you, what does liberal mean to you?" And he started telling me what he feels liberal means, and that's not at all what it means to me. And so once again, this just highlighted different words mean so many different things to so many people. And I told him, well, I guess what you're talking about, I agree with. So we'll say that I'm a liberal. I would never self-identify as one because what I understand as a liberal is something that I don't want to be. But that's also an important lesson, I think, for journalists to know and understand the groups that they're walking into, the people that you're speaking with. What do those words mean to them? If you were to, for instance, walk into a space and openly start talking about you being communist or anarchist, that could come across very poorly to a lot of people, even to other anarchists and communists, right? So what are you choosing to, how are you choosing to speak about your subjectivity, I think is also an important lesson. And again, this doesn't mean that you're hiding anything. You should always be upfront about that subjectivity, but learn how to talk about it in a way that makes sense to the people that you're speaking with. Um, and I'd say that overall, independent media does a better job of being upfront about those things, right? Like if you go to the Electronic Intifada website, they're not like trying to pretend they're objective about what's going on in Palestine. Same thing with Mint Press News or Truth Out. Like you don't have to look very far, and you don't have to have a very deep media literacy understanding to see where they're coming from, what angles. It doesn't mean that independent media is always upfront about it, but overwhelmingly. And I think one of the primary reasons for this is the mutualism that's often involved in independent or frontline journalism. The idea that either we are the people whose stories that we are trying to uplift, for instance, Appalachian journalists covering the devastation of their communities right now, or Palestinian journalists in Gaza, or we care deeply about these issues because we condemn and abhor injustice, and we see our struggles as inextricably linked with those that we are covering. And you see that again throughout the board, like across the board in terms of independent media: Truth Out, Gray Zone, Breakthrough News, Cheer Post, the Real News Network, et cetera, et cetera. And what that does is that creates a feeling of mutual respect where those affected communities learn that they can trust certain journalists and outlets to do right by them, to get the story right, to not twist their words. And then those journalists gain access to stories that would otherwise be contorted, ignored, or silenced by corporate media. Um, and the next step that I think is perhaps even more important sometimes is that it leads to a kind of solutions-based journalism that doesn't just report the news, but it tells you beyond the who, what, where, and when, the why and the how to change it, to amplify it, to echo it, whatever the case may be. And again, I'm not talking in monoliths here, right? There's no such thing as like the independent media, or, like all women say this. Like I'm not trying to talk in those kind of ridiculous platitudes here, but not not all independent journalism is interested in collective solidarity or justice or solutions. There's a lot of nuance in media. And that's, of course, why critical media literacy is so important, right? It's not just that we turn critical media literacy towards corporate media. You got to turn it towards any kind of media. Even a broken clock is right twice a day. So the New York Times will at times print things that are true. So will the Washington Post. CNN will blurt out snippets of reality in a stream of bullshittery. The difference here is the context in which that's presented, the frequency in which it's presented, and the players behind the scenes. And of course, as you all know by now, indie media is media that is legitimately independent, not only financially, but I'd say ideologically. And I think that last part is one that oftentimes gets lost. So and I've seen this, you could, for instance, have a financially independent journalist who just peddles the same reworked news as CNN or Fox, right? Like there are people who do live streams and just, here's what the New York Times says, and here's what the Financial Times says. And you're like, great, I could just go to those outlets. I don't need you. And they don't get funding from Lockheed Martin. They've got their Patreons or whatever, but they're not ideologically independent. And so to me, what makes independent journalism truly independent is not only that it's not beholden to the money of a certain perspective, but to that perspective itself. And again, it doesn't mean that the journalists don't have perspectives. Like I said, no one's objective, and I have a lot of opinions about a lot of things. But it means that those journalists themselves are critically media literate and are not willing to omit or lie about something simply because it might clash with a personal ideological perspective. So if I see something or experience something or hear from someone something that goes against my opinion on something, it doesn't matter a shit bit because it's not about my perspective. It's about the story and about what this person is sharing with me or what I'm witnessing with my own eyes. So, and I think that what this then does, when that truly independent perspective is practiced, when that truly independent media is practiced, you'll not only see a lot of nuance on many issues, you'll see, therefore, a lot less of the divide and conquer strategies and propaganda that really only serve to sever us from each other and our shared interests. And this is, of course, also why indie media is so dangerous and why they try so hard to suppress it. Not just because independent media tells the truth, but because that truth inevitably leads people across a political spectrum to turn against the political establishment and towards each other. And so in this sense, I see independent journalism as very closely tied to political education, which as an organizer is a cornerstone of grassroots organizing and activism. And I wanted to get to an example here. A mentor of mine through his works, since I know that y'all have been doing some history of muckrakers here, Mike Gold. And Mike Gold was the pen name of Ithaca, who was a Jewish American journalist and author, most active in the 1930s and 40s, who wrote of, for, and by the working class. He had weekly columns where he was absolutely unafraid of telling it like it was, from the factory floor to the tenements. He was unapologetically anti-capitalist, and he was also openly communist. His writing really shifted the concept of journalism because prior to Gold, most of the literature that was about the working class from the 19th century into the 20th was just that. It was about them, not by them. And very, very rarely from their own perspective. I mean, you could probably just think of like, oh, what writings do we have about poor and working class folks from the late 19th century into the 20th century? Oh, it's like all about them, right? Very rarely do you see something like, hey, I'm a worker and this is how it went down. And Benjamin Balthazar wrote about Mike Gold and the proletarian arts movement that Gold not only championed, but helped form. And he wrote that unlike working class representation of the previous century, the movement was concerned not only with working class authorship and working class control over the arts, but with producing a new working class subjectivity. There's that subjectivity again, right? And as Gold once famously said during a speech, when I think, it is the tenement thinking. When I hope, it is the tenement hoping. What is art? Art is the tenement pouring its soul through us. He was also instrumental in the formation of the John Reed clubs, named so after the journalist and activist John Reed, who, fun fact, my father is also named after John Reed. And Gold's call for writers, quote unquote, with a knowledge of working class life gained from firsthand context. It wasn't just a call for individuals who worked for a living to start writing. It was a call to form an entirely new collective approach to literary production and journalism. And these John Reed clubs were a part not just of a journalistic revolution, therefore, but an artistic and therefore cultural one. If, as Mike Gold said, art is the tenement pouring its soul through us, then journalism must be the tenement pouring its lived experiences through us, the way that that comes out into the world. And that is the mandate of tenement journalism, of frontline journalism. And it's not one to take lightly. It's a privilege to be trusted with people's stories, even if you're also in them, as Mike Gold was. And these clubs, the John Reed clubs, served as powerful platforms for hundreds of writers that we wouldn't know today were it not for these clubs that gave these writers the ability to learn skills such as writing, to tell their stories, and also gain access to bring those stories of the silenced to a bullhorn, to a platform, right? And I'll just take this little tangent to say, I always use the word silenced. I hate the word voiceless. Nobody is voiceless. That is such bullshit. People are silenced. There's a huge difference. And I know it might sound like semantics, but as a writer, I dabble a lot in semantics, and I think it's really important to make that distinction, because voiceless suggests this kind of like victimhood and pride in victimhood that oh, I couldn't possibly tell my own story. No, 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 no. People can. They're just silenced. Um, and I don't know how many people here have heard of Mike Gold, but he's not somebody that you hear about, not in journalism school. And even to this day, he's derided as being not that bright, because of his poor and immigrant upbringing. He wasn't a classically trained writer, you know. He's especially looked down on by liberals who feel that his writing is quote unquote too coarse. And basically what that means is that even to this day, what he created and what he said is dangerous. And it's precisely why it's not taught in a regular curriculum. It's not only a legitimate and straightforward critique of the system, it is the oppressed casting that stone, speaking for themselves, demanding basic rights rather than a pitiful charity, punching up and not down, and building active solidarity across systemic dividing lines such as race and cultural beliefs. So I bring Mike Gold up not just because it seems kind of apt to your syllabus, but because he is the antithesis of today's corporate and legacy media. And his work is a very important reminder of that mandate that we all have as independent journalists for our communities and, of course, beyond them. Because, yes, while I think it's important to ask any journalist to start where they are in uplifting stories that you know well, that you're yourself a part of, that's not all we do, you know. I have written and filmed and recorded and shared many stories that aren't mine, and had nothing to do with my lived experiences. And so here I want to make another distinction that I think for independent journalists is also really important. If it's not your story, you can't tell it. Let whoever's story it is tell it. And again, that might sound like semantics, but I'll give you an example. I was down in Puerto Rico working with mutual aid disaster relief and also reporting after Hurricane Maria completely devastated the island. And what I saw down there, particularly in the city, was corporate media hanging out at the Sheraton, which was the only place that had electricity at the time, talking with FEMA, talking with officials, while people, you know, the affected people whose lives had literally been washed away, were all on the outside, no electricity, no running water, very little food, like no potable water. And corporate media and FEMA, like corporate media was interviewing FEMA inside the Sheraton with a full buffet while the affected people were outside. How the hell is that getting the story, right? And it's trying to get the story without actually talking to the affected people, right? It's trying to tell a story that's not yours without ever talking to the people whose story it is. That's what corporate media does most of the time. And another example that I can give you that's not mine, but Electronic Intifada. This is trusted. It's a media organization that's trusted by Palestinians, regardless of whether or not the people working there are Palestinians, because many of them are not. They have shown over decades their integrity and the non-extractive nature of their work, how they uplift voices of Palestinians without twisting that voice or distorting it, sanitizing it. And that's how they've gained trust, because they, like a member of that community, hold themselves accountable to that community, and they let the people whose story it is tell that story without, again, twisting or contorting it. So I'll just take this second and ask that everybody think about, like, who are you accountable to? Not who are you told that you need to be accountable to in terms of authority, like the dean or whatever authority there is there, but like, who do you actually feel accountable to? Your family, your friends, your classmates, your roommate, whatever. Maybe, maybe not. I mean, needle that question. It's not always an easy one to answer. And it's certainly not always static. I mean, for me, that answer has changed greatly over the course of my journalistic career, just my time being a human. But what I've found is that as a human and a journalist, I am accountable to much the same people, the people whose stories I share, like my family, my community, and those whose stories I share, in the sense that I'm not accountable to the structure of the story, but to the people in the story. I'm not accountable to the editors, but the people who shared what is often painful, suffering, trauma, who went through a lot of discomfort and oftentimes fear to share their story with me. I'm accountable to them, not the editors who might want to twist it and contort it. And again, this goes back to like, who would you want going into your hometown? Who would you want talking to your parents? Would you like it to be a CNN journalist or Mike Gold? As a journalist, are you going to be a conduit or a transformer? That's some audio tech nerd speak, but like, what kind of connection are you going to have? Is it based on that respect and that feeling of accountability? Or is it based on hubris and the protection of a byline? Is it about amplifying their voices or your voice? Are you there for extraction? Like, I'm just going to take my story, I don't give a shit what happens to you, and I'm out? Or are you there for connection? Like, will you stay in touch with people after you've shared their story? Which I try to, and I think it's very important. And this then echoes out, right, into relationships far beyond journalism. And I could sit here and, wax poetic about how our entire system is based on extraction and not connection. But this question about journalism is indeed like a microcosm for the macro world in which we live and in which we try to shape. Because if, as Mike Gold suggested, with words and action, that journalism is an art form, then I will go further and quote Bertolt Brecht, who said that art is not a mirror held up to reality, but a hammer with which to shape it. And in that sense, that is and can be the power of solution-based frontline journalism. And that's why it's something that you won't see covered in most classrooms, and certainly why corporate so-called journalists don't uplift it or find solidarity with non-corporate journalists. And it's why a lot of journalists, independent journalists, are fringe. Why, we're shadow banned and censored. And that's just kind of like the life that you have to accept, right? That you're going to be derided for not being bright or being, it's like some things people have called me that actually some of them I kind of like an anarchist witch or whatever. Some that I won't repeat. You'll be called out, you'll be harassed. There was a stooge at the Daily Caller who was like stalking me at a variety of DC protests for a couple of years, and just would like come to protests and call me out and say all kinds of horrific shit. And that is part of, unfortunately, the work that of being so-called fringe, of being the outlier. So that's probably not ending on a high note, but but again, I think that if there's one takeaway from that, then I think it is that, if as Mike Gold said, that words and action in journalism is an art form, then art is not a mirror held up to reality, but a hammer with which to shape it.
Thanks, Eleanor. That gave us a lot to think about. I've got a whole page of notes here myself. So let's see what everybody else came away with and roll around the room. And questions, comments, criticism, constructive, please. But there's a lot to think about. I've got 13, lucky 13, happy Halloween. talking about independent journalism, objectivity. We don't really have a lot of objectivity, even if we pretend to. Eleanor, you talked about sourcing and subjectivity, knowing your audience. You reminded people to be honest and upfront about such things, which is basically the core of what independent media tries to do. You talked about the importance of social justice and movement media type journalism, solutions-based journalism, which we find a lot in independent media versus the corporate press. You also reminded us about nuanced space and gray areas, and that happens. We discover that when we let other people tell the stories they want to tell. You talked about ideological and financial independence. You also gave us a great historic example of Mike Gold and working class journalism, which is really important. And by the way, as you know, Eleanor, a lot of what we do know from working class perspectives really did come from anarchist writers in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And you also talked about, and this is a favorite line of mine because I just said it last night on the panel in Santa Cruz. There's no such thing as people being voiceless. It's sort of a thing that we like to say where we kind of puff up our own self-importance because we're giving someone a voice. And it's like, well, no, you're not giving a voice. If you're privileged enough, however, to have a platform, you might be able to help amplify a voice, but that's not your voice, right? Other people have voices. We just have to listen. You said so people aren't voiceless, they're silenced or censored. You also talked about the importance of punching up, not down, building solidarity, let others tell their stories. And you talked about connection, not extraction, as being a big part of solutions journalism. So those are my Cliff Notes of your talk. I know ChatGPT might do a better job, but it's not a human being, and I don't care about ChatGPT. What about you all? What did you get? Yeah.
I really liked the intersection of like art and journalism because art is something like I'm interested in, and sometimes it feels though like I'm kind of sacrificing my interest like of art by like leaning more into journalism. So I like that you can like kind of have both perspectives and incorporate it into your work.
Can you hear, Eleanor?
Vaguely. So
Yeah.
something about how art and journalism intersect.
Yeah. You want to say a little louder? Sorry.
Yeah, I like how you said about like the intersection of art and journalism because art is something that I'm interested in, but sometimes I feel as though like you kind of have to sacrifice your interest in art like to pursue like that more like objective stance with journalism. And I just like that we can kind of incorporate one into the other, kind of like feed into each other.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think it also it's also a matter of finding good editors. I've had a couple of editors, well, one in particular that like always sent my shit back and was like, Eleanor, enough with the goddamn metaphors. And I'm like, I like metaphors, okay? They're creative, they're fun, they make a point, and they just wanted, this particular editor wanted it to be like very, in my opinion, boring. And I was like, no, I write flower. I have like this flowery way that I write. This is what you get when you get me. So I think like absolutely, I think that there's a lot of space in independent media for that kind of creative writing. And as an artist myself, I can't write in, you know, that like very today is da 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 and this happened and this happened. It's like, again, to me that's not really like journalism. That's a bullet point list of shit that went down. It's like, give me the feel of the place. Like, what did it smell like? Like, what did it feel like when you locked down? Like, give me some kind of like, put me there, you know? That's how I like, that's my angle, and that's how I like to do things. So there's a lot, I think there's a lot of space. And not only that, but of course, photojournalism, which is something that I do as well. I mean, that's an absolutely artistic space, just in the pure visual art concept.
And also filmmaking. You've certainly done filmmaking. You've recorded albums. You've done photojournalism. You have a compiled book as well that you've done. Maybe say a few words about documentaries. Like how do you? Well, just very briefly talk about two of your films and just a little bit about how that intersects, and you, many of the things that you just told us, I see in your filmmaking.
Sure. So I kind of fell back asswards into filmmaking as well. I went down to West Virginia with a dear friend of mine who has an indigenous media outlet called Crushing Colonialism that I recommend folks check out. And she wanted to visit her ancestral lands, which encompass parts of West Virginia. And she asked if I wanted to go along, and I said absolutely. And before I knew it, I had like hours and hours of footage. And, we were all sitting around out in the holler one night, having some drinks, and I was like, God, I have all these hours of footage. What do I do with it? And then she said, kind of sarcastically, she was like, you could make a movie. And I was like, well, actually, I could do that. And so, this is like kind of the way that my brain works. I just started like looking into the best practices, so then I like to know the rules so I can break them, kind of thing. Yeah, so that film was called Hard Road of Hope, and did well in the festival circuit and toured also in Germany through their coal country. And yeah, and I think with that, a lot of it started with a poem that I had written about we did this flyover, because a lot of the horrific coal mining you can't really see from the road. They try to hide it with what they call a beauty screen. They have like trees that block it, so you can't really see these massive open pits that are just filled with coal slurry and sludge and death and devastation. And so you really have to get up in, one of those like prop plane, like Indiana Jones type situations. Makes you feel like very, very mortal. And you fly over it, and you just see this massive, like these massive holes in the earth. And a poem just kind of fell out of me, and that's how the film starts. And so that's also like I have to, I don't know how to like separate. I can't really compartmentalize my my various interests. So yeah, the film has poetry. I worked also on the score with a friend of mine. Um, and yeah, so I think that's also been my approach to the filmmaking, along with, of course, the journalistic approach, which is I'm not in the film much. I let people speak for themselves. I have moments where I speak about transitions and share some stats and news and things like that. But ultimately, I let people speak for themselves because, again, it's not my story to tell.
Great comment. Yeah.
Speaking a little bit more on that, when you said like if it's not your story, you can't tell it. Something that I guess is a little bit concerning for me is sometimes there are stories that might focus on like historically like oppressed or marginalized groups, and I'm concerned that if I'm not reporting on it, then they might not get the attention that they deserve. But at the same time, I don't want to like talk over them, and also like I don't want to center my own experiences in that. So how do you try and like balance respectfully covering communities while at the same time like kind of not like how do you just do it in a thoughtful way so that way you're really amplifying their voices and not kind of I don't know like I don't know. Can you speak a
Sure.
little about that?
Yeah, and it's a great question, and I think it's for me it's been different in different situations. And a lot of it depends on who I also represent. So, for instance, when I've spoken to the indigenous of the far, I'm Swedish as well, and there's the indigenous of the far north, the Sami people, hate the Swedish government, and I don't blame them. That's a colonial regime. And Sami have historically been very insular, again, for good reason. And when I spoke to them, there was a lot of tension to start with, um, because they don't know me. I am Swedish. I'm not Sami. I'm not indigenous, and they didn't trust me to start with. And so, what I started by suggesting is that we just, hang out, and I like, if it's okay, I'll come with you, and I'll meet the rain. They do reindeer herding, and I'll meet the reindeer, and I think what helped there is I had like there was some levity. I was able to make fun of myself and, I didn't mean to trip and reindeer shit, but I did, and they thought that was hilarious, and so that was like some levity that was brought to the situation. And I think just not taking yourself too seriously helps, I think, a lot of the times, because a lot of journalists think so highly of themselves. And especially in marginalized communities, they're like, yeah, you're not hot shit. Like, we don't care. We don't care about you and, your prizes from whatever press we don't care. Um, and a lot of people walk into these spaces with, these are the questions we're going to ask. This is how we'd like you to answer them. This is what we're going to cover. We're not going to show this over here. We're going to show this over here. And I think just walking into a space and asking people, like, what would you like people to know? Like, this is I'm really just the conduit. Again, I'm your amplifier. I think that makes it so that people find it easier to open up and to trust. And I think a lot of it's taking time, like when I walk into spaces that I have no like cultural connection to, and just based on a white supremacist system, I am like above them in that, like on the privilege scale. I take the same kind of care that I do when I walk into a space with poor white folks, even though I was one. Like I don't want to take up space. It's not about me. Again, like, how much space does an amplifier take up? Um, so I think that kind of humility comes across, and the not taking yourself too seriously comes across, and being willing to meet people, not just where they're at, like as if you're not like you're trying to drag them over to where you are, but like trying to engage in their culture. Like, yeah, I want to meet the reindeer. Like, let's meet the reindeer. Or like going out to somebody's backyard shed and looking where they make moonshine in a bathtub in Appalachia. It's like, cool. Yeah, I don't know if I want to drink that, but like, that's very cool. And like trying to make it feel more like you kind of just like met each other and are having a kind of friendly chat. It doesn't always work. Sometimes people will maintain their standoffishness the entire time, and that's also fine. If they still want to share with you, but they'll do it with a standoffishness, that's fine. We don't need to be friends. I would love for us to have a connection, but if that's not something you're interested in, I'm not trying to like force that. So again, I think just like walking in with that humility and not taking yourself too seriously.
Who's next? Yeah.
Kind of going off of what you said earlier about people being kind of like voiceless, and just kind of like the terms that are used within that and how you use it. I kind of liked, I know a couple of weeks back, we read an article called "Destructing a Media Propaganda and Framing from the War to the Unhoused." And I mentioned how I really loved how you said the perfect unhoused person, and how that kind of interplays with, I guess, the whole problem between the term homeless and unhoused. And I mean, I never really understood or realized the difference of both of those terms. So I kind of just wanted you to explain, I mean, how, also, how did you come up with that phrase? Because I love it, but also just explain kind of the difference and kind of go more into that, because I really didn't realize that, and how that was such an effect, and how you use that language.
For sure, yeah, and thank you for highlighting that. I think, the way that we talk shapes the way that we think. Like, words shape how we think, oftentimes not the other way around. And so homeless means that you don't have a home. And I think that especially for a lot of Indigenous people, the idea that they are homeless on their ancestral land is like adding insult to injury. But also, I myself have been unhoused, and I wouldn't say that I was homeless. I just didn't have shelter. And I think that that's an important distinction to make, because what the system tries to do with that, like what it's very convenient with the term homeless, like, oh, you're just a vagabond. You're this nomad with no connections, and you don't care about anything. You're just like this nihilist wandering the streets. It's like, what the fuck? It creates a caricature that makes it a lot easier for people to cast you aside and to dehumanize you, which is, of course, what the system does. Unhoused suggests a momentary a moment, like a moment in time, right? Because homelessness feels like a chronic condition, right? But unhoused is like, oh, well, you did have a home. You can have one again. Right now, you are unhoused. And I think that that's also an important way of looking at it. And the idea of like being the perfect unhoused person comes from, you know, who is worthy of getting so-called charity. I also fucking hate charity. Charity is a top-down hierarchical system, capitalist system that requires poor people. Otherwise, how are these rich a-holes in New York going to feel good about themselves when they go to a charity dinner and have no one to give money to? They can't parade poor people in front of them. And, you know, so the idea of being this perfect Oliver Twistian kind of unhoused person is also a creation of the system to suggest that people with addiction problems, people who are fleeing from abuse, people who don't have the correct Deine Papieren, you know, thank you to the border Gestapo, like all of these people are not worthy of support and not worthy of shelter and not worthy of community because they are not that perfect type of unhoused person. And I noticed this too when I was unhoused. I was considered to be a better unhoused person than people who were non-white and struggled with addiction problems because I'm white and I didn't have an addiction problem. So I was more worthy. Uh, Not because I had made better choices in life. I think a lot of people would say moving to LA at the age of 18 was a shit choice. But there I was among people who didn't even have a choice about their situation because they had been fleeing domestic abuse or they couldn't get proper medical care. So that the system forces people into these paradigms about how they look at other people in their communities without ever realizing that like in this system we are all one or two emergencies away from being unhoused because there's no safety net. You know, you get you know, bad medical news, your home floods and you don't have flood insurance, you know, like 70% of people in Appalachia didn't have flood insurance. They didn't think they needed it. They're living up in the hills. They're screwed. Right. So now you have an entirely new population of unhoused people in Appalachia. Are they not worthy of support? Are they not worthy of shelter? And so I think that the way that we talk about people, the way that we talk about conditions, and that moves to addiction, that moves to, you know, whether somebody has the right papers, illegal, you know, immigrants and things like that. The way that we talk about people is also then how we think about them. And a lot of this happens without us knowing about it, you know. The way that we think about various peoples in our community is done very insidiously on purpose, right? Because when push comes to shove, both parties want to make sure that you won't care about illegal immigrants being pushed out or caged. They want to make sure that you won't care about addicts being caged or the homeless people being now caged because they can't afford housing. So if you actually cared about people as human beings, it would be a lot more difficult to peddle that kind of monstrosity.
Good question, by the way. Who's next? Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead.
How do you use your lived experience to fuel the stories that you write, and how do you balance like using your voice and what you've gone through when you're telling other people's stories? Like, how do you make sure that you don't silence their voices while preserving your own?
Sure, great question. I don't really share my lived experiences in my work unless it's really pertinent. So, for instance, when I was writing about being unhoused, it was something that my editor and I had worked out that she wanted me to share that, and I felt comfortable sharing it, and that it gave the story a certain a personal perspective as opposed to me talking about it from the outside perspective of never having been unhoused. So that's why I shared that there. Most of the time I don't, because most of the time I write about things that I don't have any personal experience in, whether that be, you know, I'm not Palestinian. I'm not from West Virginia. So a lot of the things that I write about or talk about, I don't have personal lived experience. I will talk about them kind of I might talk about, like, if I'm writing a longer piece about a certain action, I might talk about what it feels like to be locked down, or what it feels like to do a tree sit, or, just to give the piece a little bit of that, like, here you are in this space. Let's like settle into this space together, and this is what it smells like, this is what it feels like. So I might do that through my lived experiences, because that would oftentimes be something weird if you started talking to someone and then they're like, let me set the scene for you. That would be a weird way to start an interview. So sometimes I'll add that just for my own lived experiences. But other than that, I don't incorporate my own lived experiences into the pieces that I write or film. I just let people speak for themselves, and then my writing speaks for itself, because I have everyone has their own writing style. So kind of like you can tell if it's Slash playing that guitar solo without looking. Like, I have my own writing style that if you read my work, you're like, oh yeah, there are those metaphors that editor hated. So you'll be able to tell that it's me without having to put and I don't do that on purpose. It's just because that's just how I write. And so oftentimes I won't add my own lived experiences unless, again, it is like very pertinent to the story itself.
Anybody else? Questions, comments? We've got minutes, we've got time. Yeah, go ahead, man.
One thing I'm just curious about is if you could think of any like working class journalists today that aren't like educated on journalists but do a really good form of journalism.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm admittedly very bad with names, but so there are a couple of Rednecks Rising is a really good podcast that's run by some folks down in Appalachia. And so I think, like, in terms of well-educated, like, I think most people have more education than I do, because I just have a BS, which I find endlessly amusing. But I think a lot of people at this point do have higher forms of education, even in places that have historically not had that kind of education. I mean, I grew up in North Carolina, and you heard a lot of folks being like, oh, I'm the first generation to go to college. So that's become more common. Whereas in Mike Gold's day, it was not common for people who lived in the tenements to even finish like elementary school or middle school. So I think it's less of a thing today, but in terms of like what a corporate journalist would find well educated, I'd say that most of us do not fall into that category. I don't, I didn't go to journalism school. I went to audio tech school. I don't have a PhD. I haven't written a lot of books and things like that. So, and most of the folks that I trust, there are some great writers at Unicorn Riot. Some great people that do writing at The Intercept as well. That's more journalistic, like the classic journalistic style. Unicorn Riot does more like classic more not classic journalism. Yeah, I mentioned Rednecks Rising. Why can't I remember the name of it's completely escaping me the name right now. I'll think of it at like 3 a.m. probably. But there are a couple of outlets that specifically are by folks who are mostly just on the front lines and don't have like degrees or anything, and just started citizen journalism because they felt that it was a need. There's Crushing Colonialism is another great one that I mentioned. So my friend Jen she has like a master's, but a lot of the people that work with her, indigenous media folks, don't have, that higher education, quote unquote. A lot of people that also in the global South that she works with that do their Spanish journalism, particularly like, journalism about the Afro-Indigenous down in Brazil and Colombia. So it's out there. It's certainly out there. It's just that I wouldn't call it's not like the same thing as the Mike Gold, because the access to education for us working class folk has shifted a bit.
Yeah, Eleanor, that's really well put. I just wanted to add a couple things to it. There's something called labor notes. I don't know if you've heard of labor notes.
Yeah.
but labornotes.org is often people, union members, working people telling, those kinds of stories. Steve Zeltzer, Work Week Radio out of the San Francisco Bay Area. Steve was a union member for ages and ages and has a really, really sharp critique of corporate capitalism and managerialism and Taylorism and so on. The curious thing too is, as Eleanor was hinting at, some of these folks have, as we get further into the 20th and now 21st century, some of these folks do have training or degrees. They don't necessarily have terminal degrees and they aren't necessarily degrees in journalism. Zeltzer is someone that comes to mind. The other person that comes to mind that does have degrees, of course, that we both know, Eleanor, and have done great work with is Max Alvarez.
Mhm.
Max Alvarez is a PhD historian, but he has the Working People podcast. He has his book is on working people. I don't want to blow the title here just because, and I actually maybe you'll get to meet Max before the end of the semester. The Work of Living, Working People Talk About Their Lives and the Year of Work, he's talking, Max goes out and actually embeds himself in working class communities. And so he does very much what Eleanor was talking about, is he goes into these places where other journalists tend not to go, and he just lets them talk. He talks with them, but then lets them tell their kinds of stories. But I think you put your finger on a pretty important space, is that there are not a lot of examples of these things, because often, quote unquote, working people who aren't journalists don't always have the time or the leisure to go and tell those stories. Historically, another person that comes to mind that was a great, known as a great storyteller, but mostly for having other people tell their stories, was the great Stubbs Terkel from Chicago. Who has, he had great stories with working people. Actually had a brilliant collection of interviews after World War II with veterans called, quote, The Good War, which, as you quickly discover, is not a good war at all. Talking about veterans and people that came back, but it's again another example of having people tell their own stories. So great question.
So It's Going Down was what I could not remember, and they do great work. They do a lot of frontline reporting, and yeah. And I think the other thing that I wanted to mention, it's like, it's not something that you would probably read unless you're working on like a larger story to take quotes from it from a larger story. But every single union has a newsletter. So like I subscribe to several. I subscribe to the UMWA, RWU, UAW. Like I subscribe to a bunch of different union newsletters that are written, of course, by union members. And they're not, of course, they're not, it's not like journalism in that sense. It's like, hey, this strike happened, or, can somebody deliver more donuts on Friday or whatever. So, but you can get a feel, like I'd say that they are also historians in the same way that journalists are historians, because they're keeping track of what's happening in these working spaces, especially since the U.S. has such low union membership these days. Those are important things to keep track of.
Anybody else? One more comment, question before we let Eleanor go? No? Well, yeah, one more.
Can you I know you had talked about like there are no safety nets within, I guess like the housing issue. So I was wondering, through your lived experience, on housing, what's like one safety net you wish was implemented, or like what safety net would you implement?
Great question. So I partially grew up in North Carolina and I partially grew up in Sweden. And though Sweden is butt scooting towards fascism at a rate that even rivals the US, Sweden still has, for instance, universal health care. And that's something that should just be like, it's really ridiculous that the richest country in the world doesn't have it. But of course, there are obvious reasons for that. But universal healthcare that's not tied to your job. For instance, Boeing machinists are still on strike. And I'm so inspired and impressed because their healthcare was pulled in early October. Boeing pulled their healthcare because it's tied to their workplace, which is a stupid thing to have. So I think absolutely that, because then at the very least, if you were unhoused, then you would have the ability to go to any hospital, any doctor, anything, and not have fear of not being given appropriate care. Now, Los Angeles did at the time when I was unhoused have free clinics where you could go in and do things like shower and things, but that's privately funded by, by people who want that to exist. It's not like a across the board. So, and I think that, this country has something like 17 million empty homes. And on any given night, somewhere around 600,000 unhoused people. Now, I think that's probably much more, but I don't think it's 16 million. So you could give every unhoused person several homes and we'd still have a bunch left over. So no one should be unhoused. It's absolutely ridiculous. It should certainly not be it should certainly not be a crime to be unhoused. And let's be honest, a lot of these people are unhoused because they don't have access to a lot of other things that precipitated their situation. So mental health care, addiction care. Addiction is not a criminal issue. It's a health issue and should be treated as such. Portugal they decriminalized drug use in Portugal, and years later, drug use was down like 80% or something ridiculous like that. Why? Because people felt that they could very easily go places and have their mental and physical health needs addressed without fearing that they were going to spend the night and potentially much longer in jail. So I think that that's a really important issue. Food, things that basically and this would never work in a capitalist society, right? But like anything that you need to survive should not be for sale. So food and water should not be something that you have to then steal. Like I had to go into places and like steal food and water. That shouldn't be something that you have to do. And especially, I saw people stealing formula. You should not have to steal food to keep a child alive. That is absolutely grotesque. And so anything that has to do with survival or even just health, I think that the goal should not be just to survive, it should be to thrive. We have every right to thrive, not just because it's the richest country in the world, but because we're human beings. And so anything that has to do with our ability to do that should not ever be for sale. And it should not be something that there are barriers to, depending on where you were born, who you were born to, any of that. So the safety net that I imagine is not something that I think that the United States empire would ever institute. But I do believe in stopgap measures such as universal health care and having access to housing, universal basic income. Every time it's been tried somewhere, it's done really, really well. Surprise, surprise, not really. So things like that I would quote unquote call stopgap measures, I think would be a great start.
And how about for our folks here, Eleanor, all of our great students, how about free education?
Yeah, that too.
So Eleanor, we're going to let you go. Thanks so much for spending the hour with us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
Anything you want to share? Any ways people can either follow your work or get in touch with you directly if they want to?
Sure. So the work that I do is on the site that Mickey already showed you, artkillingapathy.com. I'm also on the evil Twitter and Instagram at Radical Eleanor. And I do a lot of cool things, not least of all the Project Censored radio show. And so you can find me over at projectcensored.org as well.
Cool. Thanks, Eleanor. Thanks for coming and seeing us today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, y'all. Be well.